Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a story that's been hidden in plain sight. It's about a little monster with shark teeth and furry ears that's now worth more than most people's houses. And here's the spoiler. This isn't just about a toy. This is about a Hong Kong kid who moved halfway across the world, fell in love with fairy tales, and accidentally created the most controversial collectible of our generation. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't need pity likes. I want that authentic late-night curiosity energy. Oh, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, especially if you're already collecting these little demons. Now dim the lights, maybe put on some lo-fi beats for that cozy vibe, and let's walk together into the twisted fairy tale world where Labubu was born. You're 7 years old, standing in the Amsterdam airport, clutching your mother's hand as she drags a suitcase that's bigger than you are. The year is 1979, and you've just said goodbye to everything you've ever known in Hong Kong. Your name is Kasing Lung, and you have no idea that this moment, this terrifying, life-changing moment, is going to shape the biggest toy phenomenon of the 21st century. But first, let's talk about what you're leaving behind. Hong Kong in the 1970s was a neon-soaked collision of East and West. Imagine the chaos of Times Square, but everyone speaking Cantonese and the smell of dim sum fights with diesel fumes for dominance in the air. You lived in Yuen Long, a district that felt like the world's biggest construction site. Always building, always changing, always loud. Your childhood was filled with the sounds of mahjong tiles clicking like digital rain, street vendors shouting prices that changed by the hour, and the constant hum of a city that never quite learned how to sleep. It was sensory overload wrapped in humidity that made your school uniform stick to your skin like cling wrap. But now you're stepping into the Netherlands, a country where silence has weight, and space between buildings isn't considered wasted real estate. The air smells different. Cleaner, colder, like it's been filtered through centuries of windmill blades. Everything is impossibly organised. The houses look like they've been arranged by someone with severe OCD and an unlimited budget for paint. It's the kind of place where even the cobblestones seem to follow a pattern, where chaos feels like a foreign concept that got lost at customs. Your 7-year-old brain is trying to process this cultural whiplash, and honestly, it's failing. One day you're dodging double-decker buses in Hong Kong traffic that moves like a video game designed by someone who hates players, and the next you're learning that Dutch people actually stop at crosswalks and wait for little green men to tell them it's okay to proceed. It's like moving from a heavy metal concert directly into a library and someone forgot to give you noise-cancelling headphones. Here's where the story gets interesting though. Without the constant stimulation of Hong Kong, no arcade games beeping for attention, no street markets creating symphonies of organised chaos, your mind starts reaching for something else, something quieter but infinitely more powerful. You discover books, not just any books, but fairy tale collections that feel like they were written by people who understood that the best stories live in the spaces between what's real and what's possible. The Dutch have this relationship with folklore that's different from anywhere else. It's not just stories they tell children to make them behave. It's living mythology that seeps into the architecture, the art, even the way people arrange their gardens. Walking through Utrecht feels like wandering through a storybook, where every canal might hide water spirits and every forest could be home to creatures that exist just outside the corner of your eye. For a kid whose imagination has been searching for a new home, this place is like discovering that Narnia has universal healthcare and really good cheese. You spend hours in the local library, a building that smells like old paper and possibility. The librarian is a woman with silver hair who speaks English, with an accent that makes everything sound like poetry. She introduces you to Brothers Grimm, but also to older stories, Celtic legends about creatures called the Cedar, Scandinavian tales of forest dwellers who help lost travellers, and Dutch folklore about kabouters, tiny house spirits who bring luck if you treat them well. These stories hit different than the ones you knew in Hong Kong. Back there, folklore was practical, kitchen gods who needed daily offerings, hungry ghosts who showed up at specific times, spirits that had jobs and schedules like everyone else in the city. But European fairy tales, they're atmospheric. They live in the mood, in the feeling you get when morning mist clings to pine trees, or when candlelight flickers in ways that suggest someone invisible is sharing the room. At night, when your parents are asleep in your new Dutch home, you lie in bed listening to sounds you've never heard before. No traffic hum, no neighbour's TV bleeding through thin walls, just wind moving through tree branches and the occasional distant bell from a church that's older than entire cities back home. Your imagination starts filling that quiet with possibilities. What if there really are creatures living in the forest behind your house? What if they're not scary, just misunderstood? What if the sharp teeth and wild hair that make people afraid are actually signs of a creature that's just trying to help but doesn't quite understand how human society works? You start sketching. Not the Pokemon knockoffs and superhero doodles that most kids your age are drawing, but something else entirely. Creatures that look like they escaped from fairy tales but decided to stick around in the modern world. They have the wild, untamed energy of forest spirits, but there's something contemporary about them too. Like they've learned to adapt to a world of streetlights and smartphones, but never quite lost their connection to something older and wilder. The drawings are rough, obviously. You're still a kid learning to control a pencil, still figuring out how to make the images in your head show up on paper in ways that make sense to anyone else. But there's something there, a spark, a personality, a sense that these creatures exist somewhere, and you're just the first person to notice them. Your parents, meanwhile, are dealing with their own version of cultural adaptation. Your father finds work in the tech sector, which in 1979 means rooms full of computers that take up entire walls and sound like industrial air conditioners having nervous breakdowns. Your mother learns Dutch by watching soap operas and cooking shows, slowly building a vocabulary that mixes practical phrases with dramatic declarations about love triangles and perfect pastry crusts. They're proud of your artistic interests, but in that cautious way that immigrant parents approach their children's creative ambitions. Art is wonderful, they say, but also impractical. Art doesn't pay for health insurance or help you get permanent residency status. Art is the kind of luxury you pursue after you've built a stable foundation in something more reliable. They're not wrong exactly, but they're also not seeing what you're seeing in those late-night sketching sessions. School is its own adventure. Dutch children are direct in ways that would be considered rude in Hong Kong social circles. They ask questions like, "Why do your eyes look like that? And do you eat weird food at home?" With the casual curiosity of people who genuinely want to know but haven't learned that some questions create more distance than understanding. You're the only Asian kid in most of your classes, which makes you simultaneously invisible and hypervisible depending on the situation. But there's freedom in that outsider status too. You're already different, so there's no pressure to fit into existing social categories. The kids who might normally judge each other for playing with dolls or reading fairy tales are too busy trying to figure out where you fit in their understanding of the world, to worry about whether your interests are appropriately masculine or mature. You become the weird kid who draws monsters, and in a Dutch school system that values individual expression, weird is just another flavour of normal. The monsters in your sketches start evolving. They develop personalities, backstories, relationships with each other. There's one that keeps showing up more frequently than the others. A small creature with pointed ears, sharp teeth, and fur that looks like it's been styled by someone who only understands wind. It has an expression that's simultaneously mischievous and benevolent, like it's planning to help you in ways that might technically be illegal, but are definitely morally justified. You don't have a name for this creature yet. Names feel too limiting, too human. It exists in the space between domesticated and wild, between helpful and chaotic, between cute and slightly terrifying. It's the kind of creature that would absolutely steal your homework, but only because it genuinely believes your teacher needs to appreciate the educational value of blank paper. It would reorganize your room while you sleep, but according to an organizational system that makes perfect sense to forest spirits and no sense whatsoever to humans. Years pass. You grow up bilingual, bicultural, and slightly bewildered by the fact that most people seem to live in only one world at a time. You learn to navigate Dutch directness and Hong Kong subtlety, European fairy tale sensibilities and Asian practical concerns. You discover that being permanently between cultures gives you a unique perspective on storytelling. You understand both the mythological weight of ancient folklore and the contemporary need for characters that feel relevant to modern anxieties. High school brings new challenges. You're old enough now to understand that your artistic interests are either going to become a career or remain a hobby, and the decision point is approaching faster than comfortable. Your drawings are getting more sophisticated, your creatures more fully realised, but the gap between talented teenager with a sketchbook and professional artist who can pay rent still looks impossible to bridge. The art teachers recognise your talent, but they're also realistic about career prospects. Commercial illustration is competitive. Fine art is even more competitive. Character design for toys or games might be possible, but those industries are dominated by established studios with very specific aesthetic preferences. Your monsters are unique, which is both an advantage and a liability. They don't fit neatly into existing categories, which means they're either going to stand out brilliantly or be completely unmarketable. You apply to art schools anyway, because what else do you do when your brain is wired for creating imaginary creatures? You get accepted to several programs, ultimately choosing to study illustration in Belgium, because their program has a reputation for encouraging experimental approaches, and their comic book tradition aligns with your interest in visual storytelling. Belgium feels like another cultural upgrade. If the Netherlands was where you learned to appreciate organised beauty, Belgium is where you discover that chaos and beauty can coexist without destroying each other. Brussels is a city that shouldn't work, French speakers and Dutch speakers sharing space that neither group completely controls, European Union bureaucrats mixing with local artists in cafes that serve beer for breakfast and take afternoon naps seriously. Art school is simultaneously exactly what you expected, and nothing like you imagined. Your classmates come from backgrounds that make your multicultural childhood look simple by comparison. There are students who grew up in refugee camps, others whose families own entire industries. Some are there because they're brilliant, others because they're wealthy enough to treat art school like an extended vacation with homework. The diversity is incredible, but it also means the competition is fierce in ways that have nothing to do with talent. Your monsters continue evolving. Art school professors push you to think more conceptually about your work. What are these creatures representing? What cultural tensions are they embodying? How do they function as symbols in a world that's increasingly globalised but still desperately tribal? The questions are frustrating because they assume your creatures need to represent something beyond themselves. But they're also useful because they force you to articulate what you're actually trying to communicate. The creature with the sharp teeth and pointed ears becomes your thesis project. You develop an entire mythology around it and its companions, creating what you call the monsters, a collection of beings that exist in the liminal spaces between human civilization and wild nature. They're not evil exactly, but they operate according to logic systems that don't always align with human social conventions. They help when they can, cause chaos when they can't help, and generally approach life with the attitude that good intentions matter more than perfect execution. Your professors love the concept but struggle with the execution. The illustrations are beautiful, they say, but what's the practical application? Are these characters for children's books, graphic novels, toys? The ambiguity that makes your creatures interesting also makes them difficult to categorize, and the art world loves categories almost as much as it claims to value innovation. You graduate with honours and a portfolio that showcases creatures nobody quite knows what to do with. The real world of professional illustration is waiting, and it's about as comfortable as wearing shoes made of disappointment and rejection letters. Freelance work pays just enough to keep you alive, but not enough to save money or plan for the future. You illustrate textbooks, design logos for businesses that never quite appreciate your aesthetic, and slowly watch your monsters migrate to the margins of sketchbooks you fill during lunch breaks. But here's where the story takes its first real turn. In 2011, you start collaborating with How To Work, a Hong Kong-based company that specialises in illustrated storybooks. It's your first chance to bring your monsters into a professional context, to see if they can exist outside your imagination in ways that other people find meaningful. The collaboration is successful enough to continue, and in 2013, you publish My Little Planet, your first major illustrated work. The book is well received but not revolutionary. Critics appreciate your unique style and the way you blend Eastern and Western folklore traditions, but it's still operating within the familiar framework of children's literature. Your monsters are charming, but they're also contained, safely tucked into book pages where they can be appreciated without disrupting anyone's daily routine. You realise you want more than that. You want your creatures to exist in the real world, to be companions people can carry with them, to to bridge the gap between imagination and tangible reality. The idea of turning them into toys starts percolating in the back of your mind, but the toy industry feels as foreign and intimidating as the art world ever did. Then comes 2015, the year everything changes. You decide to launch the Monsters as a complete series, giving your creatures official names, backstories, and most importantly, the star treatment they've been waiting for almost your entire adult life. The creature with the sharp teeth and pointed ears finally gets a name, Labubu. The name comes from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. It has the playful sound repetition that makes words memorable, like Pikachu or Bulbasaur, but it doesn't reference any existing cultural tradition. It's a name that could exist in fairy tales or modern cities that sounds equally at home in Dutch, Chinese, or English. It's the kind of name that creates its own space rather than fitting into existing categories. Labubu's personality emerges as you develop the series. She's mischievous, but well-meaning, chaotic, but ultimately benevolent. She has the energy of a forest spirit who's decided to take an interest in human affairs without fully understanding human social conventions. She'll rearrange your sock drawer according to colour gradients that make perfect sense to creatures who see in spectrums humans can't perceive. She'll hide your keys in places where you're guaranteed to find them, but only after experiencing the exact amount of mild panic necessary to appreciate having keys in the first place. The other monsters in the series complement different aspects of this personality type. There's Zimomo, who's quieter and more contemplative. Taikoko, a shy skeleton who represents the beauty in things others might find frightening. Spooky, who embodies playful mischief. And Pato, who serves as the practical member of the group. Together, they create a found family of misfits who support each other while navigating a world that doesn't always understand their approach to existence. You create the first illustrated books featuring these characters, but you're also thinking bigger. The toy industry has been revolutionised by companies like Kidrobot and Funko, which have shown that adult collectors will pay premium prices for well-designed figures that represent characters they connect with emotionally. Your monsters have the personality depth to appeal to adults, and the visual charm to attract younger collectors. They exist in the sweet spot between cute and edgy that defines successful contemporary collectibles. But breaking into the toy industry requires connections you don't have, and business expertise that art school definitely didn't provide. You continue developing the characters and building their world through illustrations and books, knowing that the right opportunity will eventually present itself if you remain patient and keep improving your craft. The breakthrough comes in 2019, but it arrives in a form you never expected. A Chinese company called Pop Mart has been revolutionizing the collectible toy industry through something called blind box marketing. Instead of selling toys in transparent packages where customers can see exactly what they're buying, Pop Mart packages figures in opaque boxes. Customers know they're buying a character from a specific series, but they don't know which variation they'll receive until they open the package. The psychological appeal is brilliant and slightly diabolical. It combines the satisfaction of collecting with the gambling thrill of randomness. Some figures in each series are more common than others, and the rarest ones, the secret figures that might appear in only one out of every 144 boxes, can be worth hundreds or thousands of dollars on the resale market. It's like Pokemon cards for adults with disposable income and childhood trauma they're processing through retail therapy. Pop Mart's founder, Wang Ning, has built the company by identifying artists whose characters have the right combination of visual appeal and emotional resonance to sustain long-term collecting obsessions. When he encounters your Monsters series, he recognises something that his demographic of urban millennials and Gen Z collectors will connect with immediately. Your creatures are cute enough to be comforting, but weird enough to feel authentic. They have personality without being overly complicated, backstory without being intimidating to newcomers. The negotiation process is surreal. You're an artist who has spent decades developing these characters as personal expression, and suddenly you're in meetings with executives who are analysing their commercial potential using spreadsheets and market research data. They want to know which colours test well with focus groups, which facial expressions drive the most social media engagement, and whether Labubu's teeth should be pointier or rounder to maximise cross-demographic appeal. Part of you wants to protect your creatures from this kind of corporate analysis. They weren't created to be products. They were born from your childhood experience of cultural displacement, your need to find magic in mundane reality, your desire to create companions for people who feel like they exist between worlds. But another part of you realises that partnering with Pop Mart might be the only way to get your monsters into the hands of people who need them. The first Labubu series launches quietly in 2019. Pop Mart's marketing team is confident, but not particularly ambitious in their projections. They expect steady sales to their core collector demographic, but they're not predicting a cultural phenomenon. The initial production run is modest, the promotional budget is conservative, and the retail rollout is limited to established Pop Mart locations and online platforms. Then something unexpected happens. The figures start selling faster than anyone projected. Not just selling, creating waiting lists, generating social media buzz, inspiring collector communities that organise themselves around tracking rare figures and sharing unboxing videos. Within weeks, certain Labubu variations are selling on eBay for 10 times their retail price. Collectors are buying multiple blind boxes, hoping to complete sets or find the elusive secret figures. The phenomenon spreads beyond Pop Mart's traditional market. Celebrities start posting photos of themselves with Labubu figures clipped to their bags or displayed on their shelves. Rihanna, Dua Lipa, and most significantly Lisa from Blackpink, whose social media influence in Asia is comparable to Taylor Swift's in America, become visible Labubu collectors. Each celebrity post triggers waves of new customers who want to own the same accessories their favourite artists are carrying. But here's where the story becomes really interesting, and where we need to pause for a moment to talk about something darker that's been brewing beneath the surface of Labubu's success. Because not everyone sees these creatures as harmless collectibles or artistic expression. We'll explore the controversy, the religious backlash, and the conspiracy theories that have turned your innocent fairy tale creatures into symbols of cultural warfare. But first, let me ask you this. At what point does a toy become too successful? When does innocent fun cross the line into something that makes people afraid? And how do you handle the moment when your artistic creation becomes bigger than your ability to control what it represents? Pause here and let me know in the comments. Have you ever created something that took on a life of its own in ways you never expected? Drop a if you think art should stay separate from commerce, or if you believe artists deserve to profit from their creativity. Because what happens next in Kasing Lung's story will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between art, business, and cultural power. And spoiler alert, some of the people who love Labubu the most are also the ones who understand the least about where she actually came from. You're sitting in your studio in Belgium, scrolling through social media notifications that have been pinging your phone non-stop for the past 3 days. The numbers don't make sense at first. Millions of views on videos you didn't create, thousands of comments in languages you don't speak, and a level of attention that feels like standing in a spotlight designed for someone much more famous than you've ever planned to become. The year is 2024, and Labubu has just gone viral in ways that make previous waves of popularity look like gentle ripples in a very small pond. But this isn't the good kind of viral. This is the kind that comes with angry emails, religious condemnation, and conspiracy theories that turn your whimsical forest creatures into symbols of supernatural warfare. Somebody on TikTok has decided that Labubu looks suspiciously similar to Pazuzu, the ancient Mesopotamian demon who terrorized audiences in The Exorcist. And suddenly, every Christian parent group, Islamic community forum, and religious watchdog organization on the internet has opinions about your art. The comparison is ridiculous if you know anything about either character's actual origin. Pazuzu was a wind demon from ancient Babylon, associated with famine and locusts, traditionally depicted with a dog-like face, eagle talons, and wings. Labubu is a forest elf inspired by Nordic fairy tales, designed to look mischievous but benevolent, with fur and pointed ears that suggest woodland creatures rather than infernal entities. The only similarities are that both have prominent teeth and somewhat otherworldly appearances, which describes about half of all mythology and fantasy characters ever created. But internet conspiracy theories don't require accuracy. They require emotional resonance, and there's something about Labubu's design that triggers ancient anxieties about creatures that exist outside human control. The sharp teeth suggest predators. The pointed ears reference folklore traditions that many religious communities have always viewed with suspicion. The fact that millions of people are collecting these figures with near religious devotion creates its own form of unease among people who believe that level of passionate attachment should be reserved for more traditional objects of worship. The backlash starts small but gains momentum with the algorithmic efficiency that defines modern moral panics. A few concerned parents post warnings about demonic toys in their local Facebook groups. Religious influencers create videos explaining why Labubu's design elements align with traditional depictions of evil spirits. Cultural commentators write articles about the dangerous influence of Asian toy companies on Western children's spirituality. And somewhere in the middle of all this manufactured outrage, your forest elf becomes a symbol of cultural invasion, spiritual corruption, and whatever other anxieties people need to project onto something small and furry. The irony would be funny if it weren't so professionally threatening. You created Labubu as a response to childhood displacement, a character who helps people navigate the space between different worlds. Now she's being used to represent the exact kind of cultural fear and misunderstanding that you experienced as a 7-year-old Hong Kong kid trying to find your place in Dutch society. The creature you designed to bridge differences is being used to widen them. Pop Mart's response is to stay quiet and let the controversy burn itself out. Their corporate communications team has experience with social media storms, and they know that engaging directly with conspiracy theorists usually amplifies their message rather than discrediting it. The strategy is to continue normal operations while monitoring the situation for any real threats to business operations or personal safety. But you're not a corporation with a media relations department. You're an artist watching decades of personal creative development get misrepresented by people who have never seen your original illustrations, never read the fairy tales that inspired your work, and never bothered to research the cultural traditions that inform your aesthetic choices. It's like watching someone analyse a Picasso painting by describing what they think they see in the shadows, then concluding that cubism is a secret code for summoning geometric demons. The religious objections focus specifically on Labubu's teeth, and the way her expression can be interpreted as menacing rather than playful. Critics post side-by-side images comparing her to various demon depictions from different cultural traditions, highlighting visual similarities while ignoring contextual differences. They argue that children who play with these toys are being subconsciously conditioned to accept demonic imagery as normal, making them more vulnerable to spiritual corruption later in life. From a design perspective, the complaints reveal fundamental misunderstandings about how visual communication works. Sharp teeth in fairy tale traditions don't necessarily indicate evil. They're often used to suggest wildness, independence, or connection to natural rather than civilized environments. Pointed ears reference elf mythology, which in most European traditions represents beings who are mischievous, but ultimately helpful to humans who treat them respectfully. The combination suggests a creature that exists outside human social conventions but isn't necessarily hostile to human welfare. But explaining visual semiotics to people who are convinced that toy design is spiritual warfare feels like trying to teach calculus to someone who's convinced that mathematics is witchcraft. The conversation isn't really about artistic interpretation, it's about cultural authority, religious identity, and the anxiety that comes from seeing unfamiliar aesthetic traditions become popular in communities where familiar traditions are losing influence. The controversy reaches peak absurdity when someone creates a website called Labubu Demonic and starts raising money to buy and destroy Labubu figures as a form of spiritual warfare. The site includes testimonials from parents who claim their children exhibited behavioural changes after acquiring Labubu toys, detailed analyses of the characters' design elements that allegedly reference satanic symbolism, and instructions for performing cleansing rituals to remove demonic influence from homes where Labubu figures have been present. You read through the testimonials with a mixture of bewilderment and professional curiosity. Parents describe children becoming more imaginative, more interested in fantasy stories, and more attached to their toys as evidence of supernatural influence. One mother claims her daughter started talking to her Labubu figure and seemed to believe it talked back, which sounds like exactly the kind of creative play that child development experts have been recommending for decades. Another parent worries that his son's interest in collecting rare figures indicates obsessive behaviour, apparently unaware that collecting has been a normal childhood activity since trading cards were invented. The most surreal aspect of the whole controversy is that the people who are most afraid of Labubu's influence are often the ones who know the least about where she actually came from. They've never heard of Kasing Lung, never seen the original illustrations that showcase her benevolent personality, and never read the fairy tales that inspired her creation. They're responding to their interpretation of her appearance rather than her intended meaning, which creates a feedback loop where fear generates more fear without ever engaging with actual facts. Meanwhile, Pop Mart's sales numbers continue climbing. Controversy, it turns out, is excellent marketing for products that were already popular. People who had never heard of Labubu before the religious Backlash start buying figures specifically to signal their opposition to moral panic culture. Collectors who already loved the characters become more vocal about their appreciation, posting unboxing videos and collection photos that emphasize Labubu's cute rather than frightening aspects. The phenomenon creates what marketing psychologists call tribal purchasing, when people buy products not just because they like them, but because ownership signals membership in a particular cultural tribe. Labubu figures become symbols of artistic appreciation, resistance to religious fundamentalism, support for Asian creativity, and membership in global collector communities. Every figure purchase becomes a tiny act of cultural defiance, but the success comes with costs that extend beyond negative publicity. You start receiving emails from religious groups offering to pray for your salvation and deliver you from the demonic influences that allegedly inspire your art. Art galleries that had been interested in showcasing your work suddenly develop scheduling conflicts. Some retailers who stock Pop Mart products report receiving complaints from customers who object to sharing shelf space with satanic toys. The personal impact is more complex than you expected. Part of you feels validated. If religious conservatives are afraid of your art, you must be doing something that challenges established power structures in meaningful ways. But another part of you feels misunderstood in ways that echo your childhood experience of cultural displacement. Once again, you're an outsider whose creative expression is being misinterpreted by people who don't share your cultural references. The controversy also raises questions about artistic responsibility that you've never had to consider before. When you created Labubu, she was just a character in your imagination, then in your sketchbooks, then in illustrated books that reach small audiences of people who actively sought out your work. Now she exists in millions of homes, influences children's play patterns, and apparently triggers adult anxieties about spiritual warfare. At what point does an artist become responsible for how their work is interpreted by people who misunderstand its intentions? You decide to break your public silence with a carefully crafted statement that attempts to address the controversy without legitimizing the conspiracy theories. You explain Labubu's actual origins in European fairy tale traditions, describe your multicultural background and how it influences your artistic perspective, and emphasize that your creatures were always intended to represent the beauty of differences rather than any form of spiritual threat. The statement helps, but not in the ways you hoped. People who already understood your work appreciate the clarification, but they weren't the ones driving the controversy. The religious critics either ignore your explanation or interpret it as evidence of deception. They argue that, of course, you would claim innocent intentions while secretly promoting demonic imagery. Some conspiracy theorists use your multicultural background as evidence that you're part of a globalist plot to undermine Western Christian values through subversive toy marketing. But something interesting happens in the weeks following your statement. Educators and child development experts start writing articles defending imaginative play and explaining why fantasy creatures like Labubu actually support healthy psychological development. Art historians provide context about fairy tale traditions and explain how contemporary character design builds on centuries of folklore evolution. Cultural critics examine the controversy as a case study in how moral panics develop and spread through social media ecosystems. The defense comes from unexpected places. Parents share stories about how Labubu toys have helped their children process anxiety, grief, and social challenges. Collectors explain how the blind box format has created communities where people support each other's interest without judgment. International students describe feeling less alone in foreign countries when they carry familiar characters that represent their home cultures. Most surprisingly, some religious leaders push back against the controversy within their own communities. They point out that condemning artistic expression based on appearance rather than content contradicts principles of fairness and understanding that most faith traditions claim to value. They argue that fear-based responses to cultural differences create exactly the kind of division and hostility that religious teachings are supposed to help people overcome. The controversy gradually loses momentum as news cycles move on to fresh outrages, but it leaves lasting effects on how you think about your role as an artist in an interconnected world. You realise that creating popular characters means accepting that their meaning will be partially determined by how other people interpret them, regardless of your original intentions. Labubu belongs to her collectors now as much as she belongs to you. But here's what the controversy revealed about the real power of your creation. Labubu succeeded because she represents something that people need, not something they fear. In a world that feels increasingly fragmented and hostile, she offers companionship without judgment. In cultures that prioritize conformity and productivity, she represents the value of mischief and imagination. In societies that treat differences as threats, she embodies the possibility that weird can also mean wonderful. The children who play with Labubu toys aren't being corrupted. They're learning that it's okay to be different, that friendship can exist between beings who don't share the same social conventions, and that the world is more interesting when it includes creatures who operate according to their own logic, rather than everyone else's expectations. These are lessons that every generation needs to learn, and every generation of adults seems to forget. Looking back on the whole experience now, you understand something about your monsters that you couldn't see when you were creating them in childhood bedrooms and art school studios. They weren't just characters you invented, they were companions you needed during times when you felt like an outsider in every culture you encountered. Labubu succeeded because millions of other people recognized that feeling of existing between worlds, of not quite fitting into any single category, of needing friends who understand that normal is overrated. The religious controversy wasn't really about demonic symbolism or spiritual warfare. It was about the anxiety that comes from seeing unfamiliar forms of creativity gain influence in familiar spaces. It was about the fear that children might grow up with different values, different aesthetic preferences, and different ideas about which kinds of differences should be celebrated rather than condemned. But that fear, ironically, is exactly what makes Labubu's success so important. In a world that's becoming more connected every day, children need to learn how to appreciate rather than fear cultural differences. They need characters who demonstrate that being weird doesn't mean being dangerous, that having sharp teeth doesn't make you evil, and that the best friendships often exist between beings who don't understand each other perfectly, but care about each other anyway. So let me ask you this. When you see a Labubu figure now, what do you see? Do you see a demonic influence that threatens children's spiritual welfare? Do you see a commercial product designed to extract money from collectors with more enthusiasm than common sense? Or do you see what Kasing Lung originally drew in those childhood sketchbooks? A companion for people who need reminding that it's okay to exist outside the categories that other people create for you. Drop in the comments if you think the controversy was justified, if you see Labubu as the fairy tale character she was always meant to be, or a shrugging woman if you think the whole thing got blown out of proportion. Because we're about to dive into the business empire that Labubu built, and trust me, the numbers are going to surprise you. You're staring at a computer screen displaying figures that feel like they must be missing decimal points, or calculated in some foreign currency you don't understand. The year is 2024, and Pop Mart's quarterly earnings report shows that Labubu-related products generated over $400 million in revenue during the past 12 months. Your forest elf, and the character you sketched during lunch breaks because you were bored with textbook illustration projects, has become the foundation of a business empire that employs thousands of people and influences global toy market trends. But let's rewind for a moment to understand how we got from art student with monster drawings to accidental architect of collectible toy phenomenon. Because the business story of Labubu is almost as surreal as her design origins, and it reveals some uncomfortable truths about modern consumer culture that go way beyond simple supply and demand economics. Pop Mart's blind box strategy is brilliant in ways that would make casino designers proud. The psychological mechanics are identical to gambling, but packaged in a format that bypasses most regulatory oversight, because technically you're always guaranteed to receive something, you just don't know what. Each blind box contains a figure from the advertised series, but the specific character and its rarity level remain unknown until opening. It's like slot machines for people who think gambling is beneath them, but collecting is sophisticated. The Rarity distribution is carefully engineered to maximise both accessibility and exclusivity. Common figures appear in roughly 30% of boxes, ensuring that casual collectors will usually get something satisfying. Uncommon figures show up about 20% of the time, creating enough scarcity to feel special without being discouraging. Rare figures appear in maybe 15% of boxes, making them genuinely exciting discoveries. And secret figures, the holy grail of any series, might appear once in every 144 boxes, creating odds that would be completely unacceptable in any form of gambling, but feel reasonable when disguised as toy collecting. The mathematics are designed to encourage repeat purchases. If you want to collect all the common figures in a 12-character series, probability suggests you'll need to buy roughly 18 boxes to have a reasonable chance of success. If you want the rare figures too, you're looking at 30 or more boxes. And if you want that secret figure, you might need to buy cases containing multiple dozen boxes, turning a $30 per box hobby into a $1,000 obsession. Labubu's success within this system surprised even Pop Mart's experienced market analysts. Most successful blind box series build gradually, gaining collectors over multiple releases as word spreads through social media and collector communities. But Labubu exploded immediately, creating waiting lists at retail locations and inspiring secondary market prices that reached hundreds of dollars for figures that originally cost $30. The secondary market is where things get really interesting and really problematic. Rare Labubu figures routinely sell for 20 to 50 times their retail price on platforms like eBay, Yahoo Auctions, and specialized collector sites. A secret figure that costs $30 at retail might sell for $1,500 within hours of being unboxed. The most exclusive releases, limited editions created for specific events or markets, can command prices that approach luxury watch territory. This creates an ecosystem where Labubu collecting becomes a form of investment speculation. Professional resellers buy cases of blind boxes, sort through them systematically, and flip the rare figures for massive profits while selling common figures at slight losses. Casual collectors compete with these professionals for limited retail stock, driving up demand and creating artificial scarcity that benefits everyone except the people who actually want to own and enjoy the toys. The investment aspect attracts people who don't care about Labubu as a character, but recognise her as a financial opportunity. They study release schedules, track Rarity distributions, and analyse market trends with the same intensity that other people apply to cryptocurrency trading or stock picking. Some have made substantial profits, but others have learned expensive lessons about the volatility of collectible markets when trends shift or supply increases unexpectedly. Pop Mart has responded to this demand by expanding Labubu's presence across every possible product category. There are now Labubu phone cases, backpacks, clothing collaborations, home goods, and even electronic devices. Each category maintains the blind box element where applicable. Phone case designs are randomly distributed, clothing items include mystery accessories, and even some electronic products come with surprise figure inclusions. The expansion strategy reveals something important about modern consumer psychology. People don't just want to own Labubu figures, they want to integrate Labubu into their identity presentation. Carrying a Labubu bag charm signals membership in a global community of collectors. Wearing Labubu-themed clothing demonstrates appreciation for contemporary Asian aesthetic culture. Displaying Labubu figures in homes and offices creates conversation starters that can lead to connections with like-minded people. But the business success has created problems that nobody anticipated during those early sketching sessions in your Belgian studio. Mass production of complex character designs requires manufacturing precision that's difficult to achieve at scale and price points that casual collectors can afford. Quality control becomes a constant challenge when you're producing millions of figures that need to maintain consistent aesthetic standards while being profitable at retail prices under $30. Counterfeit Labubu figures flood online marketplaces, offering similar designs at lower prices but with quality that ranges from acceptable to laughably bad. Some counterfeits are sophisticated enough to fool casual buyers, while others look like they were designed by people who had only heard Labubu described through a telephone game played in 3 languages. The existence of counterfeits creates authentication challenges for collectors and revenue losses for legitimate manufacturers, but it also indicates the strength of demand that original products can't fully satisfy. The global expansion brings cultural translation challenges that would be familiar to any artist who has watched their work cross borders. Labubu's mischievous expression reads differently in cultures with varying attitudes toward childhood behaviour, authority figures, and supernatural entities. Her pointed ears reference fairy tale traditions that don't exist in some markets, but carry negative connotations in others. Pop Mart's marketing teams must navigate these cultural differences while maintaining the character's essential appeal. Regional preferences create demand for variations that stretch Labubu's design in directions you never intended. Japanese markets prefer slightly softer expressions and pastel colour schemes. American collectors gravitate toward larger figures with more detailed accessories. European buyers appreciate limited editions that reference local folklore traditions. Each regional adaptation requires your approval as the original artist, but also forces decisions about how far character interpretation can stretch before losing essential identity. The business relationships become increasingly complex as Labubu's success attracts attention from major entertainment companies, fashion brands, and technology firms interested in collaboration opportunities. Each potential partnership requires negotiations about creative control, brand consistency, and revenue sharing that feel surreal when you remember that this all started with doodles in art school notebooks. Some collaborations enhance Labubu's cultural presence in meaningful ways. Fashion partnerships with streetwear brands create clothing that lets people wear their collector identity stylishly. Technology collaborations produce phone accessories and gaming items that integrate collecting into daily digital life. Art gallery partnerships showcase your original illustrations alongside the commercial products they inspired, bridging the gap between fine art and popular culture. But other collaboration opportunities feel like they would compromise Labubu's essential character in favour of short-term commercial gains. Movie studios want to develop animated films that would require significant changes to her personality and backstory. Video game companies propose mobile apps that would turn collecting into explicitly gambling-adjacent gameplay. Toy companies suggest spin-off products that would expand her mythology in directions that conflict with your original fairy tale inspirations. Navigating these decisions requires business judgment that art school definitely didn't teach you. Each opportunity represents potential financial gain, but also risks diluting the character's cultural impact or alienating existing collector communities. The wrong partnership could damage decades of careful character development, while missed opportunities might leave money on the table during the peak of Labubu's cultural moment. The strangest aspect of the business success is how it has changed your daily life, in ways that have nothing to do with money. You can't walk through major cities without seeing people carrying Labubu accessories or visiting toy stores that dedicate entire sections to your characters. Airports, coffee shops, and public transportation reveal collectors displaying figures on bags, keychains, and phone cases. Your imagination has become part of the visual landscape in ways that feel simultaneously gratifying and surreal. Social media algorithms ensure that Labubu content appears regularly in your feeds, creating the odd experience of seeing your artistic creation filtered through thousands of other people's creativity. Unboxing videos, collection showcases, custom modifications, and fan art demonstrate how your character has inspired communities of people who build their own creative practices around collecting and displaying figures. It's collaborative art creation at a scale you never imagined possible. The financial success has provided security and creative freedom that you couldn't have achieved through traditional art career paths. Gallery sales and illustration commissions might have supported a comfortable living, but they never would have generated the resources necessary to explore experimental projects without commercial pressure. Labubu's success has created the economic foundation for artistic risk-taking that might lead to future characters and stories that push creative boundaries even further. But the business empire also creates obligations that sometimes conflict with creative instincts. Collectors expect regular new releases that maintain quality standards while offering fresh variations. Manufacturing partners need predictable design schedules that allow efficient production planning. Retail partners require marketing support and exclusive products that drive store traffic. Each stakeholder has legitimate business needs that don't always align with artistic inspiration cycles. The pressure to maintain Labubu's cultural relevance while expanding her commercial reach requires strategic thinking about character development that goes far beyond simple artistic expression. Should future releases explore darker themes that appeal to adult collectors, or maintain the whimsical tone that attracts younger audiences? Should regional variations acknowledge local cultural preferences, or maintain global consistency that supports international collector communities? Should collaborations expand Labubu's presence into new product categories, or focus on perfecting existing offerings? These business decisions have artistic implications that will determine whether Labubu remains culturally relevant as trends shift and new characters compete for collector attention. The toy industry moves quickly, and today's phenomenon can become tomorrow's clearance merchandise if market preferences change or supply exceeds demand. Maintaining long-term success requires understanding both artistic integrity and commercial sustainability in ways that most artists never need to consider. But here's what the business empire reveals about the real value of creative work in contemporary culture. People will pay substantial amounts of money for objects that help them express their identity and connect with like-minded communities. Labubu figures aren't expensive because they require costly materials or complex manufacturing. They're valuable because they represent membership in a global culture of people who appreciate whimsy, celebrate differences, and find joy in collecting beautiful objects. The success demonstrates that there's substantial demand for artistic expression that exists outside traditional fine art markets. People want to own pieces of imagination that they can integrate into daily life rather than admire from museum distances. They want characters that evolve over time through new releases and collaborations rather than remaining static in gallery frames. They want art that creates communities around shared appreciation rather than individual contemplation. So when you see those quarterly revenue reports showing Labubu generating hundreds of millions of dollars, remember that each purchase represents someone who decided that your forest elf deserved space in their life. Someone who believed that carrying a small furry creature with sharp teeth and pointed ears would make their daily routine slightly more magical. Someone who wanted to signal their appreciation for imagination, creativity, and the possibility that the world is more interesting when it includes things that don't quite fit into expected categories. That's not just business success. That's cultural impact at a scale that most artists only dream about achieving. And we're still not done exploring what that impact reveals about contemporary society. Because the story of how people actually use Labubu figures in their daily lives is going to surprise you even more than the revenue numbers did. Are you team art should stay pure, or team artists deserve to get paid? Dropper for artistic integrity, or for commercial success? Because what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between creativity and capitalism in the digital age. You're scrolling through TikTok at 2 a.m, which is either the best time or worst time to encounter the strange ways people integrate Labubu into their daily lives, depending on your tolerance for second-hand embarrassment and genuine human weirdness. The algorithm, in its infinite wisdom, has decided you need to see a video of someone's Labubu morning routine, which involves waking up their figure with gentle pats, asking if it slept well, and including it in breakfast preparation by positioning it near the coffee maker, like a furry, sharp-toothed supervisor. This isn't an isolated incident. There are thousands of videos showing people treating their Labubu figures like living companions, taking them on dates, bringing them to work meetings, positioned discreetly on desks, and creating elaborate photo shoots that document shared adventures around cities worldwide. It's like watching the evolution of pet ownership for people whose apartments don't allow actual pets, or whose work schedules don't accommodate creatures that require feeding and veterinary care. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people doing this aren't children engaging in normal imaginative play. They're adults, college students, working professionals, parents, retirees, who have decided that carrying around a small monster enhances their daily experience in ways that justify the social awkwardness of being seen talking to inanimate objects in public spaces. The psychological appeal becomes clearer when you understand what Labubu represents to people navigating modern urban life. Cities are designed for efficiency rather than comfort, optimized for productivity rather than happiness, filled with strangers who maintain careful emotional distance from each other as a survival mechanism. In this environment, a small creature that represents mischief, imagination, and acceptance of weirdness becomes a form of emotional armour against alienation and conformity pressure. Carrying a Labubu figure signals several things simultaneously to observant strangers. You have disposable income for non-essential purchases, you're familiar with contemporary Asian pop culture, you're comfortable with aesthetic choices that some people might consider childish, and you're part of a global community of collectors who share similar values about creativity and self-expression. It's tribal identification disguised as fashion accessory. The collector communities that have developed around Labubu reveal fascinating patterns about how people create meaning and connection in an increasingly digitized world. Online forums dedicated to trading, selling and showcasing collections operate like hybrid social networks and marketplaces, where people bond over shared hunting for rare figures while also negotiating complex financial transactions with strangers they'll never meet in person. These communities have developed their own languages, rituals and social hierarchies. Grails are the most desired figures that individual collectors dream of owning, but may never actually acquire. Hunting refers to the systematic searching of retail locations for new stock or rare finds. Grading involves assessing figure condition using standards that would be familiar to professional art conservators, with collectors debating whether minor paint variations constitute significant value impacts. The social dynamics within collector communities reflect broader cultural tensions about consumption, authenticity, and identity. Long-time collectors sometimes resent newcomers who discovered Labubu through celebrity endorsements rather than early appreciation for your artistic work. People who buy figures as investments face criticism from collectors who prioritize emotional connection over financial returns. Regional collector groups develop preferences and practices that sometimes conflict with global community standards. But the communities also provide support systems that extend beyond collecting. Members share advice about dealing with anxiety, celebrate personal achievements, and offer assistance during difficult life transitions. The shared interest in Labubu creates initial connections that evolve into friendships based on broader compatibility and mutual support. For people who struggle with social anxiety or cultural displacement, collector communities offer structured social interaction around shared interests. The global nature of Labubu collecting creates fascinating cross-cultural connections. A college student in Seoul might trade duplicate figures with a retiree in Berlin, facilitated by platforms that handle currency conversion and international shipping. These transactions often include personal notes, local snacks, and cultural exchange that transforms commercial activity into informal diplomacy between individuals from different backgrounds. Language barriers become creative challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. Collectors develop visual communication strategies using emoji, photos, and translated text that allow meaningful interaction despite limited shared vocabulary. The universal appeal of Labubu's design creates common ground that transcends linguistic and cultural differences, enabling connections that might not occur through other forms of social media interaction. The phenomenon has attracted academic attention from researchers studying contemporary consumer culture, digital communities, and globalization patterns. Anthropologists observe collector communities as examples of how people create tribal identity in environments where traditional community structures have weakened. Economists analyze Labubu markets as case studies in artificial scarcity, speculative investment, and the relationship between emotional value and financial pricing. Psychologists examine collecting behavior as a response to modern anxiety, noting that accumulating and organizing objects provides sense of control and accomplishment in environments where many people feel powerless over larger life circumstances. The ritualistic aspects of collecting, hunting for rare figures, organizing displays, participating in community activities, create structure and purpose that some people struggle to find through work or traditional hobbies. But the most significant cultural impact might be how Labubu collecting has normalized adult engagement with toys and fantasy characters in societies that traditionally expect aesthetic maturity to accompany age progression. 20 years ago, adults who collected action figures or plush toys faced social stigma and assumptions about emotional immaturity. Today, Labubu collectors include lawyers, doctors, teachers, and business executives who display figures in professional spaces without apologizing for their interests. This cultural shift reflects broader changes in how societies think about adulthood, creativity, and emotional wellness. Mental health professionals increasingly recognise that maintaining playfulness and imaginative engagement supports psychological resilience and stress management. The normalisation of adult collecting represents acceptance that emotional needs don't disappear when people reach arbitrary age milestones. The fashion integration has been particularly significant in changing social perceptions of toy collecting. When figures become accessories that complement clothing styles and personal branding, they transition from childish objects to lifestyle choices that signal aesthetic sophistication and cultural awareness. A Labubu bag charm becomes equivalent to designer jewellery or luxury handbag, a small object that communicates taste, financial status, and cultural identity to observant viewers. Celebrity endorsements have accelerated this transition by providing social permission for adult collecting behaviour. When globally recognised musicians and actors showcase their Labubu collections, they demonstrate that appreciation for toy design is compatible with professional success and cultural influence. Each celebrity post normalises collecting behaviour and expands the demographic that considers figure ownership socially acceptable. The impact on children's toy culture has been equally significant but less obvious. Children whose parents collect Labubu figures grow up understanding that toys can maintain value and meaning throughout life, rather than being discarded when people reach certain ages. This creates different relationships with objects, imagination, and the boundary between childhood and adult interests. Educational implications are still emerging, as teachers notice students bringing Labubu figures to school and incorporating them into creative projects. Some educators encourage this integration as a way to maintain student engagement with imagination and storytelling, while others worry about commercialization of childhood interests and potential social divisions between students who can afford collectible toys and those who cannot. The environmental impact of Labubu collecting raises questions about sustainability and consumption ethics that the toy industry is still learning to address. Mass production of collectible figures requires resources, energy, and packaging materials that accumulate environmental costs, especially when collecting behaviours encourage purchasing multiple items to find rare variations. Some collectors develop eco-conscious practices like trading duplicates and buying second-hand figures, while others struggle with the tension between environmental values and collecting desires. Digital integration is creating new forms of collecting behaviour that blend physical and virtual ownership. Apps that track collections, social media platforms dedicated to showcasing figures, and online communities that facilitate trading create digital extensions of physical collecting that might eventually evolve into purely virtual collecting experiences. Some collectors spend more time photographing and sharing their figures online than actually interacting with physical objects. The cultural export aspect represents a form of soft power projection that extends beyond simple commercial success. Labubu's global popularity demonstrates the international appeal of contemporary Asian aesthetic culture, potentially influencing broader cultural preferences and creating openness to other forms of creative expression from the region. Each figure sold becomes a tiny ambassador for artistic traditions and design sensibilities that might not otherwise receive international attention. But perhaps the most important cultural impact is how Labubu collecting has created permission for adults to prioritise joy and whimsy in daily life choices. In societies that often treat happiness as a luxury that should be deferred until major life goals are achieved, collecting figures because they bring pleasure represents a form of emotional self-care that prioritises psychological wellness over productivity optimization. The phenomenon demonstrates that people will invest significant time, money, and emotional energy in objects that help them maintain connection to imagination and creativity. In a world that increasingly feels designed to eliminate mystery, spontaneity, and individual expression, Labubu figures represent controllable sources of delight that can be integrated into even the most structured adult lifestyles. So when you see someone carrying a Labubu figure, remember that you're witnessing more than consumer behaviour or fashion choice. You're seeing someone who has decided that maintaining childlike wonder is worth potential social judgment, that supporting artistic creativity deserves financial investment, and that daily life is enhanced by companions who remind us that the world is more interesting when it includes creatures that don't quite fit into expected categories. The real revolution isn't that toys became expensive or that adults started collecting them. It's that a character born from one artist's childhood displacement became a global symbol for the value of staying weird, staying curious, and refusing to let practical concerns completely override imaginative possibilities. But we're not done yet, because the story of what happens next, as Labubu evolves from phenomenon to institution, is going to reveal some surprising truths about art, identity, and what it means to create something that becomes bigger than yourself ever intended it to be. What's your relationship with imagination in adult life? Drop a teddy bear emoji if you think adults should embrace playful interests, a chart emoji if you believe maturity means prioritising practical concerns, or a who care emoji if you think the whole phenomenon is just really expensive peer pressure. Because the final chapter of this story is going to challenge everything you think you know about the difference between authentic creativity and manufactured culture. You're sitting in your studio in 2025, surrounded by original Labubu illustrations that now feel like archaeological artifacts from a different version of your life. The sketches that used to represent personal artistic expression have become the foundation documents for a global cultural phenomenon that generates more revenue than entire countries' GDP. And you're trying to figure out whether this transformation represents the ultimate artistic success story or a cautionary tale about what happens when creativity becomes capitalism. The numbers are beyond surreal now. Labubu-related merchandise has generated over $2 billion in global sales across all product categories. There are theme parks in development, animated series in production, and fashion collaborations with luxury brands that cost more than most people's cars. A single, rare Labubu figure recently sold at auction for $250,000, more than many original paintings by established fine artists command in traditional gallery markets. But here's the question that keeps you awake at night. At what point does commercial success fundamentally change the nature of artistic creation? When millions of people own versions of your character, when corporate committees analyse your appeal using focus groups and market research, when every new design decision affects stock prices and quarterly earnings reports, is she still the forest elf you imagined during those childhood nights in the Netherlands, or has she become something entirely different? The creative process has certainly changed. New Labubu designs now require approval from marketing teams, legal departments, manufacturing consultants, and retail partners before you can finalise artistic decisions. Colours must test well with target demographics. Facial expressions need to translate effectively across cultural markets. Accessories require safety certification for international distribution. The spontaneous creativity that originally produced Labubu has been replaced by systematic creative development that optimises for commercial viability. Pop Mart's design briefs read like military operation plans. They specify market positioning goals, demographic targeting strategies, seasonal release schedules, and collaboration integration requirements that would have been meaningless when you were just trying to create characters that captured the feeling of existing between cultures. The company employs teams of analysts who study collector behaviour patterns, predict trend cycles, and identify opportunities for product line extensions that maximise revenue while maintaining brand consistency. Your role has evolved from artist to creative director of a multimedia franchise that employs hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend on Labubu's continued commercial success. Concept artists, sculptors, manufacturers, marketers, retailers, and countless others have built careers around your forest elf. The responsibility is simultaneously gratifying and overwhelming. Every creative decision affects not just artistic integrity, but economic systems that extend far beyond your original intentions. The expansion into other media formats has been particularly challenging to navigate. Animated series and mobile games require character development that extends beyond the simple, archetypal personality you originally envisioned for Labubu. Writers need detailed backstories, voice actors require consistent character motivation, and game designers demand mechanical systems that translate collecting behaviour into interactive entertainment. Each expansion forces decisions about character evolution that feel simultaneously natural and completely artificial. The theme park development represents the ultimate test of whether Labubu can exist at massive scale while maintaining the intimate charm that originally made her appealing. Theme park designers are creating immersive environments based on your fairy tale inspirations, but theme parks operate according to logistical requirements that have nothing to do with artistic vision. every attraction needs throughput optimization, safety protocols, and operational procedures that can handle thousands of visitors daily without compromising the magical atmosphere that justifies premium ticket prices. Meanwhile, the luxury fashion collaborations push Labubu into aesthetic territories that feel completely disconnected from her forest creature origins. Seeing your character interpreted through $500 handbags and $1,200 shoes creates cognitive dissonance that you're still learning to process. The craftsmanship is beautiful, the design execution is sophisticated, but the end result feels like watching your childhood imaginary friend get drafted into high society obligations she never signed up for. The cultural impact has exceeded anything you could have predicted during those early sketching sessions. Labubu appears in academic papers analysing contemporary consumer culture, museum exhibitions exploring the relationship between art and commerce, and cultural criticism examining globalization's effect on local aesthetic traditions. Your forest elf has become a case study in multiple disciplines, analysed by people who bring theoretical frameworks and critical perspectives that you never considered during the creative process. International expansion has revealed fascinating cultural adaptation patterns. Japanese markets embrace Labubu's kawaii aspects while minimising her mischievous characteristics. European collectors appreciate limited editions that reference local folklore traditions. American audiences respond to collaborations that emphasise individuality and self-expression themes. Each regional interpretation maintains visual consistency while adjusting cultural meaning in ways that sometimes surprise you with their accuracy to your original multicultural inspirations. The generational differences in collector behaviour have been particularly interesting to observe. Generation Z collectors approach Labubu as native digital culture, integrating figures seamlessly into social media identity presentation and online community participation. Millennials treat collecting as nostalgic return to childhood interest that adult financial independence now makes possible. Generation X collectors appreciate the investment potential and craftsmanship quality. Each demographic creates different relationships with your character based on their cultural context and life experience. The educational impact is still evolving as art schools begin teaching courses about character design, brand development, and the intersection of artistic creativity with commercial success using Labubu as a primary case study. Students analyse your career trajectory to understand how contemporary artists can build sustainable creative practices that balance artistic integrity with economic viability. Some embrace the commercial, integration as expansion of artistic possibilities, while others worry about creativity becoming subordinated to market forces. The counterfeit market has created its own ecosystem that operates parallel to legitimate Labubu commerce. High-quality counterfeits require sophisticated manufacturing capabilities and distribution networks that generate substantial illegal revenue, while potentially damaging brand reputation and collector confidence. Some counterfeits are so accurate that authentication requires expert analysis, creating market uncertainty that affects both new collectors and established community members. The environmental concerns have prompted initiatives towards sustainable collecting practices, but the fundamental tension between mass production and environmental responsibility remains unresolved. Pop Mart has introduced recycling programs and sustainable packaging options, but collector culture still encourages acquisition behaviours that accumulate environmental costs. Some collectors develop eco-conscious practices like figure sharing and community displays, while others struggle with the conflict between environmental values and collecting desires. This psychological impact on collectors has attracted research attention from mental health professionals studying the relationship between material possessions and emotional wellness. For some people, Labubu collecting provides healthy structure, social connection, and achievement satisfaction that supports overall psychological well-being. For others, the financial costs and acquisition pressure create anxiety and debt that negatively impact life quality. The same activity can be therapeutic or destructive, depending on individual circumstances and approach. The technology integration continues expanding as digital platforms develop virtual collecting experiences, augmented reality applications, and blockchain authentication systems that blur the boundaries between physical and digital ownership. Some collectors now spend more time interacting with digital representations of their collections than with actual physical figures. The evolution suggests possible futures where collecting becomes primarily virtual experience with optional physical components. But despite all the commercial complexity, cultural analysis and technological innovation, the core appeal of Labubu remains remarkably consistent with your original artistic intentions. People are drawn to her because she represents permission to be different, acceptance of weirdness, and the possibility that imagination can coexist with practical adult responsibilities. The commercial success happened because millions of people needed exactly what you needed when you first started sketching forest creatures in childhood bedrooms. Companions who understand that normal is overrated, and magic can exist in mundane daily life. The real question isn't whether commercial success has changed Labubu's essential character, but whether her success has changed how society thinks about the relationship between art, commerce, and cultural value. Your forest elf has demonstrated that people will invest substantial emotional and financial resources in objects that help them maintain connection to creativity and imagination. She's proven that characters born from personal artistic expression can become global cultural phenomena without losing their essential appeal. The transformation from personal sketch to commercial empire represents one possible model for how artists can navigate contemporary creative careers in ways that prioritise both artistic integrity and economic sustainability. But it also raises questions about cultural ownership, authentic expression, and the responsibility that comes with creating characters that influence how millions of people think about identity, community, and the role of imagination in adult life. Looking ahead, the challenge becomes maintaining Labubu's cultural relevance while managing the commercial infrastructure that now depends on her continued success. Trends change, collector interests evolve, and new characters will eventually compete for the cultural space that Labubu currently occupies. The sustainability of the phenomenon depends on whether her essential appeal, that weird can be wonderful, that differences deserve celebration, and that everyone needs companions who understand their particular form of outsider status, remains meaningful to future generations of collectors. But regardless of what happens next, Kasing Lung's story demonstrates something important about the power of artistic persistence and the unexpected directions that creative expression can take when it connects with cultural needs that people didn't know they had. A 7-year-old Hong Kong kid who felt displaced in Dutch society grew up to create characters that help millions of people feel less alone in their own forms of displacement. That's not just commercial success, that's cultural healing at global scale. So the next time you see someone carrying a Labubu figure, remember that you're witnessing the visible result of one artist's lifelong commitment to creating companions for people who need, reminding that the world is more interesting when it includes creatures that don't quite fit into expected categories. You're seeing proof that imagination, persistence, and authentic artistic expression can create cultural impact that extends far beyond traditional art world boundaries. And maybe, just maybe, you're seeing inspiration to create your own version of characters that help people navigate the space between who they are and who the world expects them to be. Because the real untold story of Labubu isn't just about toys or commerce or cultural phenomena, it's about the power of artistic creativity to provide exactly what people need, even when they don't know they need it, and even when the artist doesn't know they're providing it. The forest elf is still here, still grinning her mischievous grin, still reminding everyone who sees her that magic and mundane reality can coexist if you're brave enough to carry a little weirdness with you wherever you go. And in a world that increasingly feels designed to eliminate wonder, that might be exactly the kind of revolution we need.